Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with me today is Father Steven Bigham. How are we doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good, and I grew up in New York City, and so everyone's got Jewish, Italian last names and whatnot. We don't have a lot of like Anglo-Saxon last names. So how do I correctly pronounce your last name?
Bigham.
Bigham. All right.
Bigham.
There you go. Bigham. So I apologize for
Don't say
mispronouncing
big
it.
ham.
Big ham. But
Yeah.
a big ham is good on Christmas, right?
Well, in French, I'm Bigham, so that means I have two wives. In English, I'm a big ham or a mega hambon in Greek. So I like to play with names, and I have a license to do that with a name like Bigham.
Now, you're American. You've been living, from what I could tell, in Montreal for years. Is it just me, or is the food much more flavorful there?
Well, the Latin expression "de gustibus, de coloribus, non disputandum est." When it comes to tastes, we don't argue about that. We just, you like it, I like it. I'm happy with it.
I've never had a bad meal in Quebec.
Well, there you go.
Never, whether it's Lebanese, whether it's French Canadian, whether it's Asian, just they like food and taste good. So
yeah, everybody comes and brings their food with them. That's great.
It's again, beautiful country. People don't know Montreal, world's second largest French speaking city. So people should really visit.
That's it. That's what we say.
Well, it's sadly, maybe we should do a spin-off show on life in Montreal. But people are here today because of you're a subject matter expert in the issue of the history of Christian art. You've written some very provocative pieces on early art, St. Epiphanius and Eusebius of Caesarea. Really compelling stuff, and it's a real honor to have you here today. And so I think we'll just jump right into it and ask you, because the audience is not aware, if you could just give us a brief overview of your role in academia and in the church.
Well, I'm a retired Orthodox priest in I say Montreal, but I really live in Saint-Eustache. But anyway, Montreal. I was born and raised in Illinois, in Joliet. I was born and grew up in Wilmington. My mother just had her 100th birthday. Hi, Granny. And I grew up in a Presbyterian parish. And then in college, I became an Anglican. Then I was very enamored by everything Orthodox, and but it was so ethnic. Then I moved here to Montreal, and I found that there was a parish, a Russian parish, that had an English language liturgy. So I was seduced right off, and off I went. And I got interested. Somebody made an explanation of an icon once, and I thought that was cool, very cool. So I just got interested, and I went to St. Vladimir Seminary for a year, and that was the last year that Father Schmemann taught. I was very blessed in 1982. I was very blessed to be able to be there at his last full year, and had a course with him, and wrote a paper, how is death represented in icons. And then I came back here. I was ordained a priest and helped found an English parish, and then a French parish. And then I decided to go to university, PhD, and all this image stuff. And I just keep going. And so far, nobody's pulled the plug.
Now, when you were at St. Vlad's, was Father Igor Burdakov there at that point?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, there's maybe a blast from the past. So anyhow, and so I forget you taught which university were you teaching at?
Yes, I was in an Orthodox program, shall we say, at Université de Sherbrooke. I was there as a kind of lecturer and taught on icons and various Orthodox subjects, and then I retired from that, and now I just do what I do. Look at all the books in back of me. Do you see the arrow there?
Well, there's a lot of books back there. That's for sure.
And I do some painting too, but I don't paint icons. No, thank you. No.
We leave that for the truly great artist, right?
Yeah, yes. There you
The so whether it's a book or it's an article, in your opinion, what was your greatest hit? If you were to look back and go, yeah, this is
Well,
the one that got the most traction.
I think it's the one we're talking about tonight. The whole attitude of the first Christians, early Christians in the first 3 centuries toward images, that seems to, I don't know, there's a forest fire around someplace, and I got sucked into it. I wrote that a long time ago, but it seems, you know, you have. I always ask, when do we pick apples, or when do you guys pick apples? Wherever you are in New York, there. When do you
Well,
pick?
we're right across the border from Montreal, where we
Oh,
picked in County.
so
Clinton
we all pick apples in the fall,
Okay.
not in April. So you got to put in all the work, and then you get the apples at the end. So here I am, nearly at the end.
There you go. And one interesting thing you have a writing about. You call yourself a tired ecumenist.
Yeah.
But your published work the last few decades have been defending traditional orthodoxy. So, can you give us an idea, despite your leanings, because your leanings were for decades ecumenical, that you find yourself compelled to defend traditional orthodox views on iconodulia?
Well, I actually I started off in the 1960s. I was a Presbyterian then, and that was a Protestant thing, to unite 4 different types of Protestant churches. That didn't go anywhere. Then I was an Anglican for a while, and I wanted, the branch theory, Catholics, Orthodox, and Anglicans to get together, and then I could go across on the bridge, and that didn't work either. And so then I finally decided that it was time to marry the woman I've been in love with all along, and to become Orthodox. And I just always was interested in the healing of schisms. Basically, the problem of ecumenism, at least seen from the Orthodox point of view, is one of ecclesiology, of the church. There really are schisms, breakages among the Christian people. And you've got various Protestants, you've got Roman Catholics, you've got Orthodox, and the Eastern Oriental Orthodox. Well, the point of, I think, Orthodox ecumenism, and that's expressed perfectly by Father George Florovsky. I think I wrote an article about being an ecumenism, being an ecumenist like Father George, and I would say that's what I am. And his basic notion was we as Orthodox have to be there, in these meetings and stuff, to witness to the fullness of Orthodoxy, not to compromise, have a discussion. Well, we'll give up this, you give up that. No, we're here to witness to who we think we are, the church, and everybody doesn't like that. Well, not many people like that. Even Father George was not very much liked. He was kind of seen as a stringent, and he wasn't really ecumenical. Well, that word ecumenical is a very stretchy word. It covers a lot of things. But I finally, even though I was hoping, it's not going to happen. And I sort of got tired of hoping.
So what's the main impediment? Is it that people are going in with insincere motives, or is it just they're heterodox and they cannot be reconciled with Orthodox thought?
Everybody in the ecumenical movement, basically Protestant oriented, Catholics, everybody has his own vision of what the united church would be. There's a Protestant view, and of course we all get together as in fellowship and all that. Then there's a Catholic view, Roman Catholic view, where however you wiggle it, you're all going to have to be under the Bishop of Rome. That's that. With us, you have to profess the apostolic faith that we proclaim, that we think we have. And well, the Oriental Orthodox, that was the last one. I was hoping against hope that maybe with them we could get together. I have a feeling that's not going to go either. So it's a clash, I think, of of ecclesial visions, of visions of the church or doctrines of the church that we just simply have to start to talk. And mostly what my experience is that the people I have met are emotional ecumenists, that we're all together, we get together, shake hands, have tea, drink coffee. Aren't you nice? Yeah, I'm nice. We're all nice. But we don't talk about the really substantial points. And that was Father George Fulorowski's point too. It must be a theological problem. We must discuss the theology of the church, since we're talking about schisms among churches. And nobody wants to talk about that. I mean, don't talk to general Protestants about that. Catholics, well, it depends on their points of view, and a lot of Orthodox don't even want to be bothered with the thing. But I think.
So you're tired. You're tired at this point.
I'm
tired.
Yeah, I'm tired.
Sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Well, I guess so. It's just not. It's not moving anywhere. It's not going anywhere. You get together on some place in the world, and everybody comes together, and everybody says his or her point of view. You could have predicted that and saved a lot of money. Well, so I just.
Let's talk about your point of view on the subject of art now, right?
Okay.
And so I find it interesting how over time archaeology is proving that the quaint traditions of the church are actually the most compelling explanations of the existence and use of religious art. Do you think that's the case? How is that the case?
Well, I think that archaeology, especially in the 20th century, and on this question of Christian, the first 3 centuries, and the attitudes of Christians and Jews toward art. I mean, the two are very closely linked. That archaeology has been, wow, it's like a bombshell. I mean, before I don't know if I invented it, but I say it, the hostility theory of Jews and early Christians against all images based on the second commandment. And that was believed by practically everybody, that theory, and the literature and the art that we have was interpreted by most people who study the thing, interpreted in the light of this supposed hostility, aniconism, that the Jews and the early Christians had no images at all. And that was just a statement, the wall is white, there are no images on the wall, so it's aniconic. And then they explained that by the iconophobia. That means that they believed in the second commandment, that the second commandment prohibited all images. All images were idolatric. No, idolatrous. There we go. Idolatrous. And so that was including Jews and Christians. Now, in the 20th century, in a place called Dura Europos, about 1917, early 20s, the British Army first found it there in this city that's been under sand for 1800 years or so. They discovered a synagogue that, when they cleared away all the sand and stuff, was painted with pictures, biblical representations of biblical events, Moses and all the prophets, various people. Whoa, wait a minute! What? That shocked, and that was a real shock to the scholarly world, because Jews don't have. I mean, that's the idea, huh? Jews don't have images, and yet here we go in this synagogue. Well, then down the street from this synagogue, they found a house with a baptistry in it. And guess what was on the walls of the baptistry? Wait a minute. Jews and early Christians were aniconic. They had no images. Oops, error. And they didn't have them because they were afraid of the second commandment. But here you have in the baptistry Adam and Eve, a picture of Adam and Eve. You have a resurrection, the mirror-bearing women, and other things. I mean, you can. It's now become classic. You look those things up. Look up Dura Europos. It's all over the place, and you're surprised. Wait a minute. How is it possible that Jews in a synagogue could have the whole walls, all their walls painted in biblical things? Well, they must be heretics. That was the first reaction of the people who of the proponents of the hostility theory. Well, they must be heretics. I mean, they're way off and off in near the Euphrates River. They must be crazy folk, Well, the Christians too down the road, they had these images. Well, they must be heretics too. Well, then guess what? That was early 20s. Then guess what? In Israel, archaeologists started digging up synagogues in Palestine, in Israel, with all kinds of mosaics and images. Wait a minute. What's wrong here? What's wrong with this picture? How come all these Jews in the rabbinic period are putting these images in their synagogues? I mean, they're not supposed to have images. Well, there's something wrong someplace. And I have always I've always said that the problem is in the misreading of ancient Judaism, misreading of the second commandment, and misreading of the documents, the literature of the early Christians in the first centuries. It's a phony baloney theory.
So so let me clarify.
Okay.
The hostility theory, in short, taught because of a literal rendering of the second commandment that Jews and early Christians, supposedly faithful to Jewish tradition, never had any images. And over time, because of archaeology, this has become increasingly untenable. And so initially, then iconists were in denial, like you're saying, these are heretics, this is atypical. But as more and more archaeology and written evidence comes out against it, it becomes a moving target, and they start adjusting their theories to fit the modified thesis that somehow there weren't icons. Is that a good summary of
that's a very good,
the aniconist scholarly landscape?
That's a very good summary. My point is that all of the problems that the adherents to the hostility theory have, they're all based on a misinterpretation of the second commandment, which does not, although they claim it does. All images, the second commandment forbids all images and bowing down to them, the existence. They can't exist, they're idols, and you certainly can't bow down to them. That's idolatry, and that's all out. Now, that's called the rigorist interpretation of the second commandment. Now, you've got a lot of problems historically, biblically, patristically. You've got lots of problems if you try to apply that rigorous theory where you identify all images as being forbidden by the second commandment. You've got a lot of problems because, I mean, in the Old Testament itself, what are you going to do? God forbids all images, and then he tells Moses to make the serpent. I mean, Tertullian had a really bad problem with that because he took the rigorous position that image equals idol, and then a heretic, a Marcionite, who was against the Christians, he said, "Hey, look, Tertullian, your God is crazy because he forbids all images." And then he changes his mind and tells Moses to create a serpent to heal the sick Israelites. Wait a minute. And you go all the way through the Old Testament, the New Testament writers, Christian archaeology, Jewish archaeology, and in order to square the circle of this absolutist, rigorous interpretation of the second commandment, you've got to jump through like 1,000 intellectual hoops and twist your brain around and come up with these weird ideas. I mean, even what did Tertullian say to answer? Because he had to answer this heretical guy who was challenging him on his own point. And he said, well, yes, God made a special exception. Well, you wait a minute. You can't give in Revelation, God gives a revelation. All images are prohibited. And then 2 minutes later, he commands Moses to make it just doesn't fit. Now, my point of view is, and I don't think it's my point of view, but I think orthodoxy generally is. I'm trying to be, faithful to basic Orthodox principles, and that is if you start with the second commandment and you understand it as being a prohibition of making making images, and then bowing down to them, that applies to all possible images, you got a problem. But however, if you say it only applies to idolatrous images and leaves open the possibility of non-idolatrous images that can be used for various purposes by Jews, Christians, anybody, then the interpretation of the Bible itself in relation to images, of Jewish and Christian archaeology, of patristic writings, of later Christian art, and all of that seems, there's no problem. The problem disappears because we have initially interpreted the second commandment as allowing a space for non-idolatrous images. And so you've got the brazens, you've got the serpent, you've got the cherubim, you've got the bulls in the temple, you've got whatever else in the Old Testament. All the temple was decorated with all kinds of things. You don't have to jump through any intellectual hoops. That has nothing. Those images have nothing to do with idolatry.
So your point is that it appears that everyone gets off the wrong foot interpreting historical and scriptural evidence because they make a basic error in the reading of the second commandment.
Right.
It's totally out of context of what it means, even in the few chapters of Genesis surrounding the Exodus chapter 20. Yeah. And if you make that basic error, then the error just compounds when you apply it to everything else.
It's a methodological error. It's a misinterpretation of the second commandment.
Now, let's jump into some of the early Jewish evidence. I'm sure a lot of the audience doesn't know too much about it. And so, what evidence do we have of illuminated Septuagints? And what's it demonstrate about the Jewish attitude towards art before the time of Christ?
Yeah, that's a theory, because many Jewish and non-Jewish scholars, have studied Jewish art. And Dura Europus, that threw that was a biggie. How is it possible that such developed and sophisticated art, images, paintings, can appear in the year, about 240, the year 240, maybe something around there? Certainly before the year 256, because the Persians destroyed the city at that time. So let's say 240, 250, these Jewish images were painted, biblical scenes were painted on all the walls. And say your question again.
And so, what evidence do we have from the illuminated Septuagint?
Oh, yes,
what do they show us?
Yes. All right. So, you can't say that just one day somebody went and started to paint that kind of sophisticated, developed iconography. So it's a theory that the Jews in Alexandria had illuminated Bibles, just like there are illuminated manuscripts of Homer and the ancient poets. But there were, I mean, this is a supposition. There's no historical record or reference in any document that such things existed. But the problem is, how do you explain the intricacy, the
highly developed
the
nature of the
highly
Jewish art we do
developed
have.
style and artistry of Dura Europas, poof, just out of the desert? Well, one of the explanations has been that there are Jewish illuminated Bibles behind that, and that Jewish artists, and they're not supposed to be any Jewish artists according to the hostility theory. God forbade not only the images but artists too. There must have been those pattern books, that existed before Dura Europos and in Alexandria in a Jewish context, and maybe even back before the time of Christ. We don't know that, but it's certain.
Let me ask this about the lion statues found at Jewish palaces and synagogues.
Yes.
Now, like, we know for a fact those lions existed, correct?
Oh, yes, certainly.
And
they do.
And what was the significance of those lion statues? How did the Jews understand them?
Well, a lion, David is the Lion of Judah. That's a title that he's had. And lions are protecting. They're dangerous, but they can also protect. So I assume that they were put into synagogues and even into Solomon's throne as a sign of power and protection.
Did they have a typological function? They pointed to Christ?
They could. I mean, the Lion of Judah, and you can typologically project them forward, but that's hard to determine, and is to our question, our attitude.
So we just know that they had a thing for lions. How about Jewish art found at grave sites? Why do you think the Jewish art found at grave sites was symbolic?
Well, I mean, symbolic. That's another very elastic word. What do you mean by symbolic? Some of it, like symbols, like Star of David, but then there were also human figures, animal figures. I mean, if you take, again, methodological problem, if you take the second commandment as forbidding all of that stuff, the rabbis, they had them on their sarcophagi. So there's a problem there. Even though they may be symbolic, some of them may be symbolic in allegories, allegorical animals or people. That's a question of interpreting those images. But the fact is, they're there. The very fact that they exist in a Jewish cemetery, maybe the place of the rabbis, cemetery of the rabbis, that really gives a problem to the people who want the hostility theory. I mean,
so the existence of the art certainly disproves hostility theory. What connections may it have to the apotropaic function of things like mezuzahs and whatnot? Like, was it perhaps cryptic, a lot of this art, because it was viewed to be imbued with power?
Well, ancient Israel was very much tempted by idolatry and magic, and amulets and all kinds of healing things. I mean, they were right into it. I think we even have some treatises on Jewish magical things, so healing and all that. So yeah, they would have seen that these images or symbols, whatever, however you want to call them, could be imbued with magical powers. But I mean, Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, all the way back, the Bible, is 100% against any kind of stuff like that. Any kind of use of images for magical purposes, calling the dead, or all that. That's out. That's an idolatrous use of images, and not to be accepted. To what degree the biblical images have that kind of, we almost could say, magical power, that would be hard to say. I don't think you can say, like the bulls in the temple, that held up the basin there, or other things had that kind of imbued power. I don't know. That's a question maybe can be discussed, or various ideas on that.
Because like the serpent clearly fulfilled that function. The serpent in the wilderness,
fulfilled
and
that
and the cross for Christians fulfills that function. So it's interesting if maybe the cryptic nature of the art was thought of, that it had some sort of divine. It was some sort of power to channel of divine power. Now, some art, though, seems much more straightforward. You write of one midrash, which speaks of a cone with an image of Esther on one side and Mordecai on the other.
Yes.
And so, what is the significance of not all the art being cryptic and symbolic, but pretty much straightforward? It presents biblical figures as they are.
Yeah, illustrations of biblical events. Well, we don't know that coin ever really existed. That's the point. There are references to it, but it has not. It's hard to pinpoint the actual historicity of it. But what we do know is that the rabbis mentioned the existence of such a coin, which is perfectly possible that it existed, and it shows then a movement, if you want, or depends. Maybe they were going on all at the same time, of images that represented important people in Jewish history. And apparently they had no problem doing that. I mean, Dur Europa shows that is indeed the case. And Jewish history afterwards, I mean, you've got all kinds of Jewish illuminated books. You have all kinds of Jewish art. They had no problem. The only problem is if you misinterpret the second commandment, then you've got a problem how to explain all that stuff.
Let me ask you this about a contrast between Jesus' approach and artistic representation of the emperor with the Rabbi Nahum. Right? One looks at Jesus, looks at an image emperor on the coin, and like whatever, you give the coin to the emperor, while the Rabbi Nahum allegedly wouldn't look at all at coins because of the emperor and the cult of the emperors.
Yeah.
And so, what is the significance of this contrast between this rigorous Jewish strain represented by Rabbi Nahum and what we see from Christ in the scriptures?
Well, I would say this. At the base of the Christian gospel is Christ, and we see him take into his hand a coin that has an image of an idol, the emperor. He doesn't seem to have a problem touching it or using it or talking about it, and it basically says, well, it's got the emperor's image, so give it to the emperor. The Jewish, that's a fairly liberal, open attitude toward an idolatrous image. There's little chance that people would actually worship on the coin, but still, nonetheless, it's an image of somebody who claims to be a god. Now, the Jewish, particularly that particular rabbi, I don't think all rabbis took that position, but he would not even look at it because it was idolatrous. So there was at least in Judaism a much stricter, rigorous attitude towards such things than Jesus had. And that's at the base of our whole religion, the attitudes and actions of Jesus. So at least we see that he did not have rigorous attitude that the rabbi had. And I mean, this is no proof of anything that's going to come later, but it is an indication that at the root of the Christian experience and gospel, Christ does not manifest a very rigorous attitude toward even an idolatrous image.
Now, let me ask you about this, because I think the reason why a lot of people are intrigued by the hostility theory is they'll read things from like Josephus, where he makes it seem like it's the end of the world whenever they make images of anything. And so my question to you would be, did Josephus exaggerate how rigorous Jews were towards art for political reasons, or did Jews at the time exaggerate how offended they were for political reasons? Like, well, what role did politics really play with this?
Well, Josephus, he does take, you have to remember for whom he's writing. He's writing because he was actually a rebel he fought against the Romans in the Jewish rebellion. And now after they lost, he went to Rome and wanted to write for the Romans to justify his own position and to justify Jewish attitudes. And so he does write. You can see he's telling the Romans sort of what they want to hear. Now, on the question of the attitude, Jewish attitude, he takes a very rigorous position that's saying all images are idols, and that's why the Jewish people revolted against Rome, because not because they don't like Rome, but because Caligula tried to put a statue of himself in the temple, and there were Herod tried to put a golden eagle on the temple, and of course an eagle, that's a Roman symbol of power, and also can be a symbol of some kind. So he tries to sort of placate the Romans. Now, did he exaggerate the hostility of the Jews at the time? Well, again, if you take a look at what existed at the time and before the time of Josephus, you can see that the testimony of other writers and archaeology doesn't bear out his really very rigorous interpretation. So Josephus, he even went so far as to condemn Solomon. I mean, come on. Josephus condemned Solomon for putting bulls and other things in the temple. I mean, no Jew anywhere in all of history condemns Solomon for idolatry. I mean, they'll condemn him for other things, many wives, pagan this, and all kinds of stuff. They never condemn Solomon for violating the second commandment. But Josephus,
now, like we know from the Talmud that the days of the Rabbi Yohanan and Abuns, and that's in the 3rd and 4th centuries, that there are walls painted with and mosaics were made. So does this suggest that Judaism was consciously becoming less cryptic and more explicit in its art forms? Or do you think that in reality that those art forms would have existed in Josephus' time and he was just pretty much being dishonest? He was gaslighting the Romans.
Well, I mean, Josephus is the 1st century, and these rabbis that you mentioned are the 3rd and 4th century. So there's a bit of a time gap there. It's simply, I would say that those rabbis simply attest to the fact that Jews are filling this category of non-idolatrous art with more content. It was rather restricted in the biblical times, but in the more shall we say liberal time, they they were able to see that as long as they were not idolatrous and people didn't worship them, then they could be used for biblical, instruction, and that wasn't a problem. It's a problem, of course, for the adherents of the hostility. There, how come you? This is the idea, huh? Jews are anachonic; they have no images, and they have no images because they're afraid of second commandment. Well, then how come you've got all these rabbis saying, they witness and they don't condemn them for this on the grounds of the second commandment?
Now,
they don't like to be maybe distracted in their prayer, so they close their eyes. But nobody accuses the people of idolatry.
Now, Goodenough claims that the Jews in the diaspora modeled their religion on Greek mysticism and wonders about the possibility of a non-idolatrous Jewish iconography developing the desire to imitate Greek culture as much as possible. It almost sounds syncretistic. What evidence do we have that the Jews venerated art, if any?
Well, we have to be careful. The question of veneration, that even in the second commandment, there's a difference between the existence of images and their worship. So I don't know. I mean, there's no indication that there was any kind of liturgical acts done by the Jews toward non-idolatrous images.
Because on that note, the Babylonian Talmud in the Targum of Leviticus 26:1 indicated that the art was understood, it appears to be, only as ornamental, because it banned at least its worship. The quote, I think it's the Targum of 26:1 of Leviticus: "You may set in the floor of your places of worship, so long as you do not do obeisance to it." So it seems to be pretty explicit that they're saying you could make the art. It could serve maybe the ornamental function or perhaps even an apotropaic function, but not to actually pay homage to the art. So this would seem that the Jewish understanding, at least from what we have from the explicit evidence, to be different from what we understand the Orthodox view of art is.
Well, we as Christians or Orthodox Christians, we don't have to defend what the Jews did or didn't do toward images. All we want to do is use their testimony to the existence of non-idolatrous images in the synagogues and approved, and that's all we need. We don't, they said, the rabbi said, you can't worship these images. So what else is new? There's nothing. Okay, you're not supposed to worship these. Yeah, well, we agree. Whether they had, whether they, saluted or, did some other kind of thing in reference to wall paintings or that we don't know, and I don't think that has any relevance, because we're in Christian times with these rabbis. It has any particular relevance to the notion of of honoring or venerating images.
Yeah, my suspicion would be if the art was on the location of art is a good indicator of its function. And Father Richard Price makes that point about Orthodox icon portraits that were made front and center, where you were to face it in a space of worship, compared to what I just read from the Targum, where the art's on the floor. It's pretty hard to imagine stepping on it and then venerating it. So I think oftentimes when we interpret the historical evidence, we have to make judgment calls based upon what are they describing its function and where it is as an indicator of how it was understood.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's start getting to the earliest Christian views of art. Is the Acts of John the earliest reference to how Christian art was used?
Yes, that's about what, 150, something like that. That document does two things. It witnesses to the fact that at 150 about, there already existed an image of St. John, and that his disciple had it secretly painted. He did, and then he put it up on his shelf or something and put a candle, I think, and some flowers, which would be definite signs of veneration, of honoring, of respect toward it. But then the reaction is St. John in the story. He thought first it was an idol, and then when he found out it was a picture of himself, he thought, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that. That was why do you want an image of me? My lowly." He was very humble about not wanting to have his image painted. But what's interesting, he doesn't condemn it as an idol, even when he knows it's an image of him. He does not invoke the second commandment to denigrate it. He has a kind of, why do you want a picture of this body that's going to disappear? You should want an image of an ethical image of virtue, and that's impossible to paint. So the whole document is a problem because it seems to be fairly way out there on the edge, even if not heretical, perhaps Gnostic in its origins. But we don't want to put too much weight on it. But what it does do is a witness to the fact that a painted, what we would even call today an icon, and that it was honored by the disciple of John, that did exist. So you take that.
So the point is, it shows the art existed, and it speaks about how it's used.
Yes.
And we could evaluate the significance of this one way or the other, but that's what's indisputable.
That's what's indisputable.
Now, let's talk about Saint Irenaeus, who wrote something about art a few decades later. He makes mentions of the Caprocrates, or however you pronounce them, and he appears to make a dichotomy between the crowning of art, and then he says the other modes of the Gentiles. And so, would you infer that the crowning of art was something that wasn't necessarily condemned by Saint Irenaeus, while the other modes of the Gentiles was something maybe negative? And would the significance of that then be that there's a proper way of treating art and an improper way of treating art?
Well, yes. I mean, that's the whole point of the reinterpretation. I mean, our interpretation of the second commandment. If you have this category of non-idolatrous art, then you need to have its existence. That already is bad news for the hostility theory. But then what do you do with it? What do you do with any images that happen to have been put into churches or wherever they are? Do we accept the possibility that there is, and here I make the distinction between a cultic art. Cultic art is what the pagans have. I'm not the first to do this, but here we're talking about it. Liturgical art. Was there, could the first Christians have imagined a place for liturgical images in the first 3 centuries? We've got the catacombs art. We've got in 200 in Rome or North Africa, depending on how you interpret it. A chalice with the design of the Good Shepherd on it. I mean, wouldn't you say that if you had a chalice with that was decorated like that, that would be a kind of liturgical art, a way of using non-idolatrous art to preach or to beautify, the Christian liturgy? Well, I would say yes. It certainly would be the case. And this distinction between cultic art, which goes with idolaters, and liturgical art is very important. That distinction, and having the mental space for non-idolatrous art, liturgical art, opens up the whole question of what is the meaning of veneration. And I have noticed in listening to various people talk and reading and writing things that the emphasis is on the veneration of icons, and almost as though the idea is that of what happened in iconoclasm. What was the practice in iconoclasm? And then that veneration of icons, with almost the word veneration has a tonality of worship. It's almost like, I mean, this is the classic, you're mixing together worship and veneration. I mean, it's classical for the adherents of the hostility theory to do that, because it's to their purposes. Their argument tends to fall apart if you really distinguish between those two classes of art. And so what is veneration? I mean, are we, as Orthodox, as Christian, do we say that icons as we know them today, even as we knew them at the time of iconoclasm, that they existed in the first century, that the apostles knew them, that the people, the bishops of churches after Christ, the first 3 centuries, they had images as we know them today? I don't know if you could say that.
All right. I was giving stage directions to my wife in the background.
Okay.
So, what is the significance of Saint Hippolytus asserting that they're, to quote him, counterfeit images of Christ that were allegedly copying an image fashioned by Pilate? So,
yes.
The question is, if someone's making the accusation that there's counterfeit images, does that imply that there was real or acknowledged accurate images of Christ, or is this a overall critique of making any image of Christ and that being counterfeit in its function?
That's the whole question of interpreting Irenaeus. He obviously condemns statues of Jesus in a syncretistic, cultic situation, where Jesus is associated with all the poets and philosophers. That would be totally unacceptable, and that's natural. What else would you expect? But it does not speak to the question: could Irenaeus himself have imagined? Could there actually have been in his churches some kind of liturgical art, some kind of liturgical images? That possibility stays open. And wouldn't that be nice if we could discover something in Lyon, in France, where he was? It would be nice, but at the moment we're left with that problem of interpretation. Does the fact that he condemned the statue of Jesus among the Carpocratians, does that automatically mean that he condemned all kinds of images of Jesus? I think that is a real stretch, and destroys the separation between idolatrous and non-idolatrous and liturgical images. But back to the question of veneration. What does veneration means? Giving honor, giving respect to images. Now, what did the early Christians in the first 3 centuries, did they make any kind of gestures? Would they have put their images up on the wall? Would they have put candles in front of them or flowers? We don't know that, but all of that would be indeed veneration. They are giving honor. They are honoring the images of Christ or of the saints or biblical people, and that's veneration. So I have a little bit of a problem with hostility theorists who want to put such a wow on the veneration of icon, bowing down. Of course, the word bowing down, ooh, wow, that's the second commandment. But showing veneration, showing respect to images or people that deserve respect, I think again that's restricting the categories. We know, for example, I think St. Gregory of Nyssa, we know that he witnessed to the fact that Christians bowed down to the images of the emperor. He says that very clearly. And when he's talking against Julian the Apostate, who he was a smart cookie, he was a Christian but then became pagan, and says, I'm going to fix those Christians. I know that when my image as the emperor passes by, they bow down. I'm going to fix it so that in my images, there's going to be images of devils and gods. And they won't know. So when my image goes by, they'll bow down in reverence and veneration to my image as emperor. Okay, but then I can say, they also bowed down to gods and devils. What he does is witness to Christian practice, at least in terms of the image of the emperor. And he doesn't condemn that. It's standard practice. It's a Roman custom. Christians did it. So what else? It was non-idolatrous, especially with Constantine. They wouldn't do that with Decius or Diocletian, because they claim to be gods. But with Constantine, an image is an image, and it's the image of the emperor. So when we either honor the emperor himself or we honor his image. Those two have a very special relationship.
And we also know in St. Gregory of Nyssa, in praise of Blessed Theodore, the great martyr, he speaks of the veneration of and depiction of that martyr. So the same practice applied also to Christian images. Now, let's get to, because I think it's the most misused proof text in this whole discussion, and there's very similar ones to this. So I think by discussing this one, we could kind of deal with the whole genre of proof text, and this is of Origen. Origen and the other apologists make arguments that Christians don't have images and altars. But we know for a fact that Christian churches, in fact, did have altars. In fact, in your book, you quote Origen's homily on Joshua, where Origen says that they consecrate altars with the blood of Christ, vis-a-vis the pagan altars. And so does this prove that the fact that whenever these apologists speak of Christians not having images and altars, the fact that we know Christian altars existed, does this disqualify the use of such texts as an iconist proof text?
Well, here we have the confusion. We use, they use those three words, altars, temples, and images, in a pagan idolatrous context. And of course, he says, we Christians, we don't have any temples, we don't have any altars, we don't have any images. Well, if you see what he's saying, he's talking about pagan temples, altars, and no, we don't. We didn't. You would walk into a church at the time, and the pagans would be looking around for an idol of some kind. There aren't any. They would be looking around for some kind of an altar, probably with blood on it, red on it. They don't see that. A temple, well, a temple is a building that has been that is used strictly for cultic practices.
Yeah, to if I can interrupt, to emphasize, in ancient times, the pagan temple just had the priest or priest officiating in it. The people weren't inside.
No,
Christian areas of worship had the priest or bishop and also the laity all in one building, because there's a priesthood of all believers. So it would have been functionally very different in the eyes of people at that time.
Oh, yes, it would be very functionally different, very liturgically different. We use the word liturgically different, but are you? Would you want to say that Origen's at what? He's 250.
Yeah.
That at 250 there were no buildings that the Christians used specifically for liturgical purposes? That's tough, because we know in about 270, something like that, the emperor, I forget who he was, ordered that in Antioch the churches be given back to the Christians. Well, wait a minute. The Christians had no temples. Well, they certainly had no temples as pagans imagined, but they did have buildings. And even the Greek word today for a temple is a naos. And we sometimes talk about the church as a temple. That's okay. So what's the problem? Altars. Well, we already heard that, was it Tertullian or Origen said, the pagans consecrate their altars by pouring the blood of goats and whatever. And listen to this is him talking. We consecrate altars, he uses the word, with the blood of Christ. Wow. I mean, that's drawing a parallel that creates a real problem for the hostility theorists, because they want to exclude everything that has a pagan origin, that it is totally illegitimate for Christians to import anything into the church and make it Christian. I mean, that's a principle that you're gonna kill you're gonna kill practically a very great part of Christian tradition. Look at the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd image is not a Christian image. It goes way back into Greco-Roman period, the Kriophoros. So it's not a Christian image. However, people, the Gospels, they see this Roman pagan image, and what are they going to think of? They're immediately, in a Christian context, they're going to think, Christ the Good Shepherd. And so what did they do? They simply took that pagan image, baptized, and here I use the word baptized that statue, not really, dumped it, but changed
they reconstituted its purpose, just
they
like
reconstituted its
the halo of Apollos,
and gave it a new meaning. They integrated it into a Christian context. I say they baptized it, and they used it to express their own faith. I mean, that process of the early Christians adopting and adapting things coming from the pagan Roman world, idolatrous world. They obviously didn't adopt pornographic pictures. I mean, you can't fix those up, But
they tried during the Renaissance.
That's another discussion. Certainly not in the first 3 centuries. Yeah. Okay. So that process of taking from the Roman culture, the Greco-Roman idolatrous culture, taking the things that can be baptized using them to proclaim the gospel. That is a fundamental principle that is operating in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. And I think to say, oh, that's pagan, it is a pagan, and therefore reject it, that's, you just kill a big swath of Christian history. And that is my basic point, that early Christians, because they inherited from the Jews this notion of idolatrous art, images, and non-idolatrous art, they were Jews, so they took that with them.
Now, let's talk about the grotto. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me finish here.
I didn't hear you there. Sorry.
Okay, they took they had the category of non-idolatrous art, and they then looked at the Roman culture, Greco-Roman culture, and saw things that they could use. They saw images they could use, they could baptize, bring them into a Christian context, and use them to proclaim the gospel. I say that is the origin of the development, if you like, the integration, not the corruption, the integration of Greco-Roman elements into Christianity, which could be baptized and used to proclaim the gospel. It was a very powerful tool. Images at the time were very powerful. Christians adopted them, and then adapted them for the proclamation of the gospel.
Now, as for the grotto at Nazareth, does it demonstrate how Christian art was used? It speaks of, in one rendering of the inscription, that under the image of M, it's adorned or something to that effect. Yeah. So would this show that this is how we know the Christian art was used? It was used in a veneration practice.
Well, yes, that inscription is very problematic, because it's got holes in it all over the place. So how are you going to reconstitute what was really there? Well, there are various interpretations. One of them, which I quote in my book, that I've noticed that it says Mary and her image, and we adorned it. Okay, that is recognized as one of the possible reconstructions. That's not the only possible reconstruction, but what you have to do is allow that it is a possible one. It's not illegitimate to fill in the holes with that kind of interpretive completing the sentences. And so it is possible that underneath this inscription, or somewhere around, there was, that would certainly be the obvious place in Nazareth, an image of the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. That's possible, and that was adorned. That is, we cannot confirm it. We cannot state it as a fact. However, what that evidence does do is open the possibility that was what was there.
How about the other renderings? What is the gist of other possible renderings, if you remember?
Oh, I'd have to think of them.
Because from what I've seen, the alternative renderings, pretty much the word that appears to be image or icon, they're like, well, this might not be clear enough, so we just don't know what that word is at all. And so they just take that whole part out of the sentence. And they seem just to be less clear from what I could tell.
You can do that. We're all confronted with the ambiguity. We don't know what actually was written there. So somebody can say, this word doesn't fit, I'm going to take it out. Well, if it's actually there on the wall, taking it out, that doesn't seem you have to leave the word there and interpret it in some other way. Okay, fine. But my point is that other interpretations are possible, including the one that was made by Bagatti, that there was an image there and we adorned that image. That's possible. Thank you. That's all we need.
I'm sorry.
In my opinion.
Now, when does Bagatti date the image? And does it have to be dated before Constantine's construction of the church there?
Well, that's another question. Dating is always a problem. The catacombs, what date do we give to the catacombs? It's probably pre-Constantinian because Constantine built over it. So we assume
if it's underneath, it's got to be older. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's the whole principle of archaeology. What's farther down in the earth is older. I mean, so we don't know when. Was it right at the first century? Did the Christians at Nazareth do that right away? When it happened, we can't say that, but it certainly is pre-Constantinian. Now, and evidence for for the attitude of Christians in the first 3 centuries.
Now, in the same site, you speak of an image of a personified cross that includes Jesus' face. Is it Jewish Christian? And if so, does it predate Constantine's church and the Gentile pilgrimages there?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, that's a very primitive, and we don't know that it's Jesus's face. It's a face of a man. It would be, the connection. It's a cross. Face could be Jesus. Yeah, that's a very old symbol image. I mean, it sort of combines symbol and image. I would say that's certainly pre-Constantinian. The actual date, there we go. The problem of dating all the time.
Now, what are we to make of the artistically crude and colorless images at that site in Nazareth, and how do they contrast with icons?
Well, colorless is colorless, and they don't have any colors. There may be just scratchings or drawings with, charcoal of some kind. Our images, and even, going back to Europos, those are all colored. They're all painted. Again, whether they're colored, what colors, or whether they're not colored, just charcoal drawings. For the thesis that we are promoting, that really is insignificant. What colored or non-colored, they are images in a Christian, an early Christian context. That's all we need. Anything else is, it's nice, but we don't need that to maintain our theory.
Now, what is the reliability of the 5th century tradition that St. Luke painted an icon of the Theotokos?
Yeah. That's the whole question of the traditions. The traditions about New Testament iconophilia. Obviously, the most we can say, in all intellectual honesty, is that tradition says. We have this 500, a reference that St. Luke was also a painter, and that he painted the first images of the Mother of God and Jesus. Well, what can we say? Tradition says. It's 500 years. In terms of historical validity, 500 years, that's a long time to have no previous indication that such is the case. If there were other indications, well, that would strengthen the tradition, but there aren't any. So we're ultimately left with tradition says. Now, however, there are several traditions that link, that go back to New Testament times, that are iconophilic. Now, again, the most we can say historically, factually, is tradition says. But even the traditions become a historical fact. That several of these non-verifiable traditions project back an iconophilic attitude into the New Testament. That is a historical fact, although it's not a proof. But nonetheless, in the eyes up, let's say, the first 500 years or so, the notion was, people thought that in New Testament times, they were Jesus himself with the face icon image, that they were not adherents to the hostility theory. Historical proof that we don't have, but nonetheless, that attitude, that feeling that iconophilia is associated in the minds of Christians with the New Testament, that's a very interesting historical fact, shall we say.
Now, what do you think of Eusebius Caesarea's view of religious art in Paneas, Mamre, and Jerusalem and Constantinople? Some infer that it was negative. Some infer he was neutral. Some infer he's positive. What do you think?
I think that if you take all of Eusebius's authentic writings that talk about images, and he's got quite a few, you put them all together, talking about the Emperor Constantine and Daniel, a statue of Daniel in a fountain in Constantinople, and an image of the three angels to Abraham, the hospitality of Abraham. He says that in Mamre, that he's seen an image there of the visit of the three angels. If you take all of, and he doesn't say, second commandment, idolatry, terrible, terrible. No, he says that's, he either doesn't say anything or just mentioned it. I mean, if he thought it was an idol, he probably would have said something. But then you take all of these mentions in Eusebius's authentic writings, you put them all together, and you can't help but come away. He was either neutral or very favorable to images. He was not an iconophobe. He was not an iconoclast. That is, now, if you have to make the distinction here, we take into account only those references in his authentic and uncontested writings. Now, where then does the dominant, I mean, it's practically everybody says Eusebius was the father, was iconoclast, he was against images. It comes from this letter, supposed letter, that the half-sister of Constantine, Constantia, wrote to him asking for an image of Jesus. And he supposedly writes back to, in this letter, says, "Oh, what are you doing about a terrible, awful thing? You know we can't do that. You can't." This letter, which is very iconophobic, this letter is the only piece of evidence that is, if you take it as authentic, that indicates that Eusebius was an iconophobe. All of his other references, he kind of dismissed them. Oh, wait a minute. You've got all these other references to iconophilia, and then you have this letter that is against, is iconoclastic. I mean, isn't there a clash there? Isn't there a problem? Now, take this into account. What is the history of that letter? When does that letter appear for the first time in the historical record? Can you guess? Maybe you've read, so you know.
The Council of Hire.
It comes into the historical record in the time of iconoclasm. And all of a sudden, this letter, which has no existence in the body of literature of Eusebius up to that time, it simply is not there. All of a sudden, this iconoclastic letter appears in the hands of the iconoclast. They sort of open the drawer. Look what I found here. You know, Eusebius takes our position. Well, come on, guys. There's first off a clash between his iconophilic texts and this letter, which doesn't appear for another 400 years. And it's only the iconoclasts that say that it's there. Doesn't that ring bells and lights go off? Isn't that if you're going to be serious interpreter, serious historian and theologian and all that, that is very, very suspect. Now, if the letter itself is inauthentic, or it's been a doctored, or the basis is a real letter that the iconoclast doctored, then suddenly the problem of the clash between the Eusebius's image references and this letter disappears. I mean, it's like Occam's razor. What is the simplest explanation is the most probable. The problem is caused by this letter that just plunks down in the middle of the Eusebian corpus, being iconoclastic, contrasting with all the rest. If you remove that letter as inauthentic as we have it today, the problem disappears. And what did St. John of Damascus say about Eusebius? And this is before iconoclasm, St. John of Damascus. He quotes three of those references to images that Eusebius makes and says, look, you see, bravo for Eusebius. St. John of Damascus saw Eusebius as iconophilic, not iconoclastic. And he's like 70 years or so before iconoclasm? He's a little bit after. So from his point of view, Eusebius, the testimony of Eusebius is iconophilic and not iconoclastic. So I take the position that Occam's razor, the simplest way to reconcile the conflict, is simply to say that the iconoclasts either invented it totally, or they took a real letter and doctored it such that they claimed Eusebius as an iconophobe, when in fact his reputation up to iconoclasm was iconophilic.
Now, let me ask
a problem disappears.
Now, how about the authentic text that no one disputes, where Eusebius talks about the art in Paneas, and he calls it Gentile and allegedly of the Savior. Doesn't this imply disapproval?
Well, now let's go back to the whole notion that Christians, Gentiles or Jewish Christians, whatever, it doesn't matter, were able to look out into the Greco-Roman world, and see things that they could adopt and adapt. Now, this woman was obviously non-Jewish. She's Gentile, okay, and of pagan origin, okay. But why, and this again is the confusion thing. Every reference to pagan or Gentile or so, that is seen to be as negative. Why is it a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing for this woman to have, I mean, assuming the story is right, assuming that she, as a pagan, knew that they put up statues to honor people who have done something. She didn't claim it was a god. She didn't worship it. She just did what was natural for Gentiles, and that was to erect a statue to Jesus who healed her. Now, there are all kinds of problems, of course, with whether that was really a statue of Jesus, whether the woman in the gospel really erected that, or did she just adopt one that somebody adopted one and put it there and called it Jesus, or there are all kinds of problems with that statue. But I see no reason whatsoever to interpret a Gentile custom as essentially negative. She simply did, I mean, assuming the historicity of the story, she simply did what was natural. She adopted and adapted what other Christians were doing, things from the Roman pagan culture, and Christianizing them. Now, it's also interesting. St. John of Damascus, who obviously is iconophilic, he quotes that precise passage as evidence for Eusebius's iconophilia. Now, I mean, St. John's, he's a smart cookie. Would he have quoted as a testimony to iconophilia an author where he said, "Oh no, I think that a Gentile custom." I think he was. He quotes the whole passage, and as bravo for Eusebius. He's showing us how great this lady was for doing that. He did not detect any negative connotations in the words. He thought it was great.
And apparently neither did the iconoclast, because they wouldn't use this proof text.
I don't. Yeah, that's interesting too. In a negative sense, they didn't come up and say, "Oh well, look, Eusebius said this, that," and he was obviously putting down, Gentile or pagan. No, they didn't do that. They didn't do that. Oh, one of my candles.
Uh-oh.
One of my candles just popped. Okay, I won't burn the house down. So no, they wouldn't want to. They wouldn't want to quote Eusebius on that either, because they didn't sense. They didn't, and these are all Greek-speaking people, with knowledge of Greek literature and linguistically very sophisticated people. They had the iconoclasts themselves sensed a deprecatory tone to Eusebius. Don't you think they would have picked that up right away? No, they didn't. So I think I think it's illegitimate, or really it feeds into the notion that anything pagan of pagan origin is automatically suspect and contaminated. If you go that way, look, didn't we adopt the 25th of December as Christmas? I mean, even the Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, still, they acknowledge the 25th of December as Christmas. They don't use it or believe in it, but in the New Testament, is there any mention of the 25th of December? No. Is there any mention of celebrating feasts? No. Is there any indication that we should have temples, that we should have churches, buildings that are exclusively dedicated to liturgical worship? No, none of that's in the New Testament. And yet, who today would really say, because it's not in the New Testament, that's pagan, out, buildings out. In actual fact, you could make an argument that in the Bible, in the New Testament, God does not live in a house. God does not, his throne, the whole cosmos is his footstool. He doesn't live in houses. He doesn't need temples. You could make an argument that the adoption and adaptation of temples, either pagan or Jewish, into the Christian, and the baptism of architecture, you could make an argument that, that is all pagan stuff. The whole architecture thing is pagan. You just go, there's no end to the craziness of that. Occam's razor, if you simply say that early Christians saw things in their own culture that were compatible with their Christian faith, they then adopted and adapted those things, baptized them, whether celebrating feasts or building buildings or poetry, literature, all the things, the problems disappear. And there are no problems. The only problems are for our friends who are the adherents of the hostility theory.
What I find very interesting about that text is Eusebius is acting as a historian. And in so doing, his observation is that however you evaluate whether it's positive or negative, the custom of that Christian art, he infers, is from the time of the apostles. And it's our earliest historical analysis of Christian art is that it's from the first century. So it's pretty fascinating. It's a pretty fascinating passage.
Yes, Eusebius, when he quotes about the lady that put up the statue, and the local custom says that it reproduced Jesus's actual physical features. He quotes that, and he's not quite, I don't know. He says, as it is said. So it indicates he has a somewhat of a doubt on the question, but it's not an impossible notion. And he also says he has seen icons, we call them icons, images of Jesus, Peter, and Paul, which were thought to reproduce their real features, physical features. Now, if you state something like that, and you say, well, it's possible, what does that imply? That implies that there is a chain of portraits going back to an original portrait. I mean, if you say that they reproduce the actual features, then somebody must have seen the actual features, painted something, and then the next people did it and passed on the tradition. And he does not react against that possibility. He simply states it, and well, maybe it's true. I don't know. But he doesn't react against it. And again, that pushes then portrait painting back into the New Testament, back into the New Testament times. Well, now you again have the historicity question. That doesn't mean that, in fact, what he saw were portraits that go back to original ones. But again, the historical interest here is that he thought such a thing was possible. He did not reject the possibility that paintings were made of the apostles and Jesus at their time, and that those images have been reproduced down to his own time. He didn't. That was not a crazy idea. Who thought that up? Yeah, okay, well, it's possible.
Now, why did Eusebius describe the art in Jerusalem's church as he quote him, the prophetic visions in apt illustrations of the symbols? Was art in churches more cryptic in those days, and may that imply that it was not venerated?
We have the problem of, he uses the word symbols. That word is notorious. I mean, it stretches all over and covers many things. However, in Eusebius's writings, he uses the word symbol for portrait images and other art images. He uses the word symbol. So we cannot exclude although in the context, he doesn't actually say what those symbols were. The fact that he uses the same word to talk about other real images of people and events opens the possibility that the church in Jerusalem was painted with Old Testament images, prophetic images, he says, that needed to be explained. And he would, whatever those symbols were, he was very, I mean, he was flattered that he was asked to preach in the Jerusalem church there and explain that. I mean, that was a big deal for him at the end of his life. So, that is a real witness, a real testimony that it was very probable that there were paintings in the Jerusalem church in 335 or so, about then, and that he was called on to explain them. I mean, bravo, that's great for our side, huh?
Now, let me ask this on Eusebius. We already touched on your questioning of the authenticity of the letter Constantia being of Eusebius of Caesarea. What evidence could there be that it's just not specific enough? It's another Eusebius. And there's another scholar, Mary Charles Murray, who also argues that it's not a authentic letter of at least Eusebius of Caesarea. Could you discuss what her argument is and speak of your theory of what other Eusebius might have wrote this?
Well, first off, okay. Could another Eusebius have written it? Okay, yeah, that's possible, I suppose. Even if there is another Eusebius that writes it, it still doesn't appear until 400 years afterwards in the hands of the iconoclasts, which makes it a bit suspicious. So whether it's, I mean, we don't know that, and that's sort of speculation. What Murray is, I'm a little bit. I'd have to look at her particular point of view, but I think she was very close to my point of view, seeing that it was seen as inauthentic.
Yeah, I think her main point was that it would be atypical for the actual Eusebius, who's so deferential to royalty, to be so critical and scolding Constantia.
That's one of the points that you stack up on the inauthentic side. That Eusebius was very pro emperor, and he might have been. That might be a sign that somebody else's hand is in there. I think too. If you read the end of the letter, he says something that, in the context, I mean, where is he getting this from? He says, Who's ever seen, he's talking to the empress, who's ever heard of such a thing? You know, paintings in churches, images of Christ. Wow, that nobody has that. That doesn't exist anywhere, and nobody's ever heard of such a thing. So how is it that he doesn't say it exactly, but how can you be so dumb as to ask for something like that? Well, we're in the year 330 something. Now, what do we know about the existence of Christian images from Eusebius himself in his authentic works, and from Dura Europus, from the Good Shepherd on a Chalice from North Africa in 200, other things around? I mean, that somebody who has traveled and studied history as much as the real Eusebius did could make a statement like that? That, where do you get that from? No, that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Nobody would dare to ask of such a thing. I mean, doesn't that kind of ring bells and flash warning signs that something's wrong here? And
Oh, what do you make of the theories that does Eusebius change his mind? He was so smitten by his
yes.
relationship with Constantine that he just liberalized on the question.
Yeah, you see, that's there you see hostility theorists trying to jump through intellectual hoops and save the letter, which they see, they're not stupid. They see that there is an obvious conflict between this letter and the authentic documents of Eusebius. So they worked with the notion of, well, he changed his mind. Well, okay, you can say that. You just say it. Well, that doesn't. That's an explanation that doesn't. You're trying to keep the sheep and the goats. You're trying to keep two things together that don't go together, and they come up with a rather, well, in my opinion, a rather flimsy explanation that, well, he changed his mind. First he changed his mind twice then. First he was iconophilic. That's when he wrote all these other things. Then he changed his mind and became iconophobic to write this letter. And then he becomes iconophilic again when he writes about Constantine and Constantinople and all the wonderful statues and wonderful things that are there, the images. So he's got to change his mind twice. I mean, come on.
Is there a possibility that divorce from context and seeing the images that they're talking about and the actual image, in all these different passages, that there could be critical passages and positive passages that are explained by their view as positive, negative, depending upon what the arts looked like and its use? And so, for example, in Constantinople, the Christian art he described was in fountains, and they're in the marketplace. They were in public, and perhaps he found it negative to have art in different contexts. So, is it possible that there's difficulty for the historian to nail down whether something's positive or negative, because we can't always perceive precisely the context they're critiquing or extolling, for that matter?
Well, we certainly do have to take into account the context. And the sort of implied criticism there in that presentation, that way of presenting things, is that, well, Eusebius statues in fountains, okay, but there weren't any in the churches. There weren't any images in the churches. I mean, that's the kind of inference that you pull out of that. Well, I mean, Constantinople in 330. Does anyone really want to say that all the walls inside the churches at that time were white?
Because Jerusalem's church wasn't.
Jerusalem's church wasn't.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. I don't think I've never heard of anybody who would say, I mean, as a historian, that would be that all the churches in Constantinople in Constantine's time and Eusebius's time, the interiors were all white.
Now,
I don't think so.
Let me ask this a very basic question about the Ante-Nicene period. Is there any explicit evidence that the Christian art that existed was not venerated?
What do you mean by the word venerated? Do you mean that they showed that it existed? Okay, we'll grant that. Even the hostility theorists grant that here and there things existed, even in churches. Are you willing to say that they in no way honored these images? They in no way showed reverence to these images? They in no way decorated them? I can't. Now that's the problem of the word veneration, because usually the hostility people are thinking in terms of icons as we know them today, and all with the incense and the candles and kissing and touching and bowing down at times. That's what's in their head as veneration, and of course, that's all bad stuff. That's all pagan imports. Well, if that's the image you have in your head when you go back and try to study the existence of images and what Christians might have done to them or in their presence, you're going to come out with, I think, some pretty messed up interpretations. Probably, I mean, I'm saying this as a probable thing. I can't affirm it. Probably what we call today veneration, that probably did not exist in the pre-Christian time. I mean, in the first 3 centuries. I'll grant you that. So what? So what? The Japanese bow. Americans, you salute the flag. The British stand up and bow to the king now. Or the president comes in, you stand up. All the photographers and news people, they stand up. All of that is veneration. All of that is, the judge comes in, you all have to stand up. We all have to stand up. The general goes by, you have to salute. Anglicans, when the cross goes, they bow to the altar. I mean, all of those gestures are corporal expressions of respect, honor, veneration, if you want. They are all expressions of our attitudes toward objects and people that we deem to be worthy, honorable people. Does anybody think that those kinds of gestures are idolatrous? Nobody would say that. But they are, I would maintain, they are gestures of veneration, even to the bowing down. Now, we know Christians bow down to the emperor's image. We know they did that. We have testimony from Saint Gregory of Nyssa. They did that. So they must not have thought bowing down even to the image of the emperor was anything idolatrous. So why would they feel it idolatrous if they manifested some kind of respect toward an image of Jesus, of Mary, of the saints? I mean, ask most of the hostility theory people. If you had a picture of your beloved grandmother that you loved, and she died, And you have that picture, and you look at that picture and you think, oh, Grandma, I really love you. I really miss you. I give you a kiss. Whoa, wait a minute. You're kissing an image? Wait a minute. If you can kiss the image of your grandmother, a picture, you can't kiss an image of Jesus or St. Paul or the apostles? Wait a minute. I mean, it's exactly the same thing. You kiss, or you put grandma's picture up on the mantle. You might even put a candle in front of it. I mean, they did that with Lady Di when she died. All the flowers and candles and pictures and stuff. Nobody ever accused them of idolatry. So why, if I can, or you or anybody, can kiss a picture because of love, out of love and respect of your grandma, why would you condemn as idolatrous kissing the picture of Jesus? Can't you kiss? What if you kiss the Bible? Have none of the hostility theorists, have they ever, the Bible, this is our Bible, we love our Bible. Thank you, Lord, for giving us the Bible. Is that an idolatrous act? Come on. But it is a veneration act. It is an act of respect. It is a physical, corporal gesture expressing love and affection for the Bible or for your granny or for Jesus. So what's the problem? Why do we have a problem with that? Well, we only have a problem if, of course, in our head is the hostility theory, that any kind of physical gestures of honor and respect and love toward the person represented, if it's a religious person, that's idolatry. But Granny, she's my Granny. The conflict of ideas and practices is just, to my mind, is just so egregious that the Occam's razor of separating idolatrous art, cultic worship of worship of idols is on one side, condemned by the second commandment. On the other side is non-idolatrous art, which can be adopted and adapted for Christian or Jewish use. It seems so natural and so simple. Why cross your wires and send intellectual sparks all over the place to try to save a theory that, well, I think is untenable.
If you don't mind me it's getting too late for me here. Editorializing a tiny bit. It's just that,
what is editorializing? That means giving
veneration's culturally conditioned. It depends what is considered venerable in a given society, place, and time. And so
obvious in Japan. Do we bow like the Japanese? No, we don't. It's not our culture. We do if we're in front of them. We bow like they bow. Okay, that's nice. But we don't do that ourselves.
So in the Ante-Nicene evidence, adorning is obviously one of the explicit forms of veneration because the sources detail it. St. Irenaeus mentions crowning. Acts of John mentions adorning the image, and the Acts of John specifies it's in honor of the image. The most plausible reconstructions of the inscription of the grotto at Nazareth speak of adorning or arranging something for the image. And so we have that. But something that I find very interesting is in the passage from Eusebius in the statue allegedly reconstituted or made by the hemorrhaging woman. that the plant supposedly heals, and the plant grows from the feet of Christ to the bottom of the brazen cloak, as Eusebius calls it. And so, how could the plant be reputed to heal unless people bent down, prostrated, and then touched the bottom of the cloak where the plant was, in imitation of what the hemorrhaging woman allegedly did to the bottom of Christ's cloak? And so I think any basic interpretation of that passage demands an active form of prostration and veneration of the image, and one that excludes pagan worship, because people aren't worshiping it as God. They're obviously just following the motions in homage of the hemorrhaging woman. They're bending down and touching and looking to be healed in the same way she was. And so the explicit Ante-Nicene evidence is of adorning and prostration as the practices of veneration. And what we lack is a source like we've seen with the Jews, the Targum of Leviticus 26, where it flat out forbade paying obeisance to the image. So unlike the Jews, where we have an explicit source that forbids it, we lack that in Ante-Nicene Christian sources. But what we don't lack is actual descriptions of veneration practice in those same sources. So it kind of puts the aniconist inference and the hostility thesis, puts the evidence on its head and turns it upside down. So that'd be my editorializing. And Father, being that you are the scholar, you could go poke some holes in it, and then we could ask 2 or 3 audience questions because we don't want to take too much of your time.
You have to unplug me, otherwise I'll keep talking. That's
well, Father, we don't always have you, so you can keep talking. My wife's not yelling at me yet.
So, I mean, if you've got questions from people there, maybe
So you don't want to poke any holes in my editorial?
No, poke holes in your thing. I don't. The only historical text that I know of, I'll have to think of that. I think this is right, that shows that Christians actually bowed down to an image is from Gregory of Nyssa. They did that to the emperor's image. That's clear. I mean, you just, it's there. You can't knock it. You can't dispute it. I'm not sure there's any other piece of evidence that is so qualified, so authentic that Christians in the first 3 centuries, actually did that kind of veneration. Now, I'm not saying they didn't, because they certainly did in the year 325, 360, something like that. So they could easily have done it before, but I can't point out a text or even an image showing them doing that to support that. So I will be a little bit hesitant to say for sure, Christians before Constantine actually did that. I leave open the possibility, however, that they did.
Do you affirm they crowned the images?
Well, isn't that what Irenaeus says?
All right. So again, it's culturally conditioned. What you're saying is
what we
can't guarantee is later body postures and manifestations would have been the same earlier manifestations. They could have been just different.
They could evolve. You've got Egypt, you've got Syria, you've got Turkey, you've got Greece, then you've got Rome, so North Africa. I mean, all of these, England. I mean, all of these people must have had very different ways of showing honor. The Gaulois, they carried Asterix on his shield. I don't think any American or Canadian general would want their soldiers to carry them on a shield like that. But so I think there's a lot of wiggle room in the actual form of veneration, of honoring, and it could change from here to there without changing the actual meaning of it, and that is showing honor, respect, and love to people and objects that you think are worthy of such respect.
Now, Father Stephen, let's if it's okay, let's jam a few audience questions. We got this. What would Father Stephen say to the fact that the seeming majority of scholarship still holds to a hostility thesis? So, what's your response to saying, well, you're the minority?
I'm David and they're Goliath. I acknowledge that 100%. But be very careful. We have many examples in history precisely where David wins, and that, you know, somebody who sets out a theory too early gets zapped, and later on, great. I would say that the hostility theory was not invented by 19th century German liberal Protestants, but it was kind of codified. There's an article by Hugo Koch, 1917, German guy. He goes through and takes all of, and this is what I use in my study. He goes through and quotes all of the patristic, the pre-Constantinian authors, and says, look, you see, they're against images. You see, he's against images. They're all against images. And that's where you get people who say the unanimous witness of the authors of the pre-Constantinian period are all against images. What's in their heads? What's in their heads is that any use of the word image automatically means idolatrous. And so, you've got several apologists. I forget the guy's name. Aristides. He's out there. More of those rotten pagans. They have all these idols and they do this and they do that. That's terrible and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So what's new about that? You would expect Jews and Christians, to denounce idolatry. Okay. There's nothing new in that. But to take that tirade, really, tirade against idolatrous images and idolatry, the worship of idols, and take that and use it to exclude the possibility of non-idolatrous images adopted and adapted into the church for its preaching purposes. That really, and if you have that separation in mind, you read through all of the quotations, the ones that we've been talking about, all the other ones that Koch used in his explanation.
My favorite from him is his quoting
about idolatry. They're not talking about the possibility of de-idolicized Christian images, liturgical images. They're not talking about. They're talking about idolatry. They're totally off the wall. They're irrelevant to the question. The question of Christian images adopted and adapted for the purposes of preaching.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of false equivalence made, and sometimes it's just the eisegetical treatment, the evidence. Like Koch treats the passage from Saint Methodius of Olympia. I hope I don't have the name wrong, but the Saint Methodius, he treats his discussion of the creation of images of angels, and he treats it as a negative. Like how would you read this passage as something negative about art? And there's just so much. There's just a very biased presentation from that majority scholarship that really is just not tenable, would be my opinion on that.
To speak to the question there, I'll grant you, in our Western world, which is heavily influenced by the Reformation, by the Renaissance, by the Enlightenment, arguments against history, arguments against continuity in history, arguments, mentalities against tradition. I mean, that's par for the course, you know. All of that has influenced, I'm saying, has influenced the mentality of Western European, North American scholars, so that they have simply absorbed this anti-image, anti-history, anti-tradition notion. And what is one of the foundational points of the Reformation was that what came before the Reformation was corrupt. I mean, the New Testament, great. Yeah, there's Peter, Paul, church, and all. Yeah, that's great. And then as you go out into history, all it does is go downhill. All it does is become corrupt. They take pagan things into the church. And what happens to the church? It dies. Or it gets so corrupted that it has to go, and whoop, 1517 pops up, and we have a Reformation, and now we're going to restore the true church and the true faith. Well, the position that I and you, even Catholics, believe in is that of tradition, of historical continuity. There was no break. There was no break. There was no corruption. There were corrupt things, of course, you know, lots of corrupt things, but there was no corruption in the apostolic preaching. That's called the doctrine of indefectibility, not infallibility, indefectibility. That the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. Well, if everything went downhill after the apostles, well, he wasn't very effective, was he? We believe, Orthodox and Catholics too, we believe that no, he protected all the way through all the countries, all the times, down to our very time. There's historical continuity. The church has an address, and it's always had an address. Whereas, obviously, before Luther or Calvin, there were no Lutheran churches. There were no Calvinist churches. So the whole Protestant sola scriptura is the elimination, the cutting of the link, the historical link. And they can't, obviously there were no Lutheran churches before Luther. And so what did Protestant thinkers do in order to counter the Catholic attack, saying precisely that? You are phony baloney churches because before Luther and Calvin and the other guys, you didn't exist. You didn't exist. And they there's nothing to say about that. That's just true. And they really felt that as a sting, a Catholic sting, and they had to invent a new notion of Christian history. And so what the people who are called the Magdeburg Centuriators in Magdeburg, 1600 something, they came up with a defense. They were Lutheran. They came up with a Luther, but then it was taken over by all Protestants. They came up with the notion of not a visible church with historical continuity protected by Christ himself, but they came up with the notion of a spiritual church, an invisible church, such that the institutions out throughout history, they aren't the church. The real church is the invisible, faithful Christians throughout history whom we don't know. And so they propagated that notion of that historiography, which has permeated the whole of Western scholarship for, and here I come along. Well, I think the Orthodox come along. The Orthodox have been in the West now in sufficient numbers and sufficient intellectual ability to speak to this predominant Protestant vision of things in a way that, oh, well, now maybe we have to be taken seriously. After all, we do represent the patristic tradition from Christ through the fathers, through Constantinople and on and down to Russia and down to today. We represent a continuous theological tradition that is as authentic and authentically defended as anybody else's thing, anybody else's position. So here
Now, well, let me ask a tough question on that note. And this comes from Silas. He says, it seems safe to say that the bishops of Nicaea too, right, that continuous tradition, believed that the veneration of icons was apostolic. But by historical analysis, this seems wrong. How do we face this issue?
Okay, I think there's the problem of veneration. What is meant by the word veneration? And in most people's heads, it is the bowing down in front of icons and incense and all the stuff that we do today. Our position is not invalidated by the fact that we may not be able to project that back into the first few centuries. It's a development of different physical gestures to express respect, love, and veneration. We don't have to say they all bowed down and banged their heads on the floor. We don't have to say that. All we have to say is that in some way, they showed respect, love, and honor to images of some kind. They don't have to be like what we have now. That's all we need. That's all we need to say that the artistic tradition of the church goes back somehow to the apostle. I was in Paris at the Protestant university, Protestant seminary there. It was an ecumenical thing with Orthodox and Protestants. And we were talking about Christian symbols and things like that. And one of the professors, this is a Protestant, Reformed Presbyterian type Calvinist, and he said, "Yes, well, I sort of think maybe that kind of thing could go back to the apostles." What? I came up out of my chair and I said, "Sir, are you aware that you just said a very revolutionary thing?" No, he didn't. He wasn't. What do you mean a revolutionary thing? You just said the very thing that the bishops of Nicaea said. What we say is quite possible, and which Protestants and the hostility theory people have denied all the way along. Here you have this Protestant professor saying that it is not impossible that the use of symbols goes back to the apostles. I mean, Lord have mercy. If that's not revolution on this subject, I don't know what is. I mean, that guy said it's quite possible that Nicaea was right and that we're right.
And I'm going to say, as Orthodox Christian, that it's probable, because based on the ante-Nicene sources we discovered, Eusebius speaks of realistic portraits. St. Irenaeus speaks of realistic portraits. St. Hippolytus speaks of realistic portraits. So though we do have like Clement of Alexandria and others making mention of other kinds of art, what it seems to be the majority is we're talking about realistic portraits and art that's like the Good Shepherd, where there's clear figures and they represent God and the saints. And we have explicit descriptions of how they were treated. They were adorned and used for healing. If we're going to go by what, say, Gregory and Nyssa says about the martyr Theodore, what Eusebius says about the image of Christ made by the hemorrhaging women. And so what we see is the Doctrine of Nicaea 2 is the explicit historical evidence. It's not going to visually, they don't say, well, they kissed the images. They might have, but we doesn't say that explicitly. But does it explicitly describe veneration? Yes. Are these images actual images of beings, of God and the saints? The answer is yes. And that's literally the decree of Nicaea 2. So what I see is historical consistency, even if there's certain quainter traditions from hagiographies that in other historical sources would be harder to nail down. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a great question from Timothy Honeycutt, which is, what is the earliest account of myrrh streaming icons and also of miracle working icons, which through a healing occurred? We just discussed a couple, at least, alleged healings in the 4th century. St. Gregory Nyssa and Eusebius mentioned that. But how about myrrh streaming? It seems like miracles are culturally conditioned. Like they'll do different kinds of miracles. I don't know any miraculous plants anymore, like Eusebius talked about. So how about, Father, when did the myrrh streaming thing start?
Well, I don't know.
There we go.
I don't.
You know everything.
I don't know, and I don't think anybody else does. Now we're into the realm of the wondrous. The wondrous. Now it is. I have to admit. I will readily admit that the Lord can work in any way He decides, through any medium He decides, and if He wants to perform miracles, healing through images, that's His business. And I personally am rather reluctant. And you might say, "Well, Father Stephen he's a liberal. He doesn't believe in miracles." Well, I don't not believe in miracles.
You just don't believe every story you hear.
But I don't believe every story I hear. I believe in the principle that it's quite possible, but whether in this particular case it's this, that, or the other thing, there have been so many examples. I mean, so many examples of fake this, that, and the other, that I don't want my faith to be based on miracles. Miracles and visions and apparitions and all of this kind of, I am not, I think all icons are miracles. It depends on the word miracle. If you mean a magic trick, that does a poof thing and suddenly, well, I don't know. There's one thing I wrote once about the face, how an icon looking at someone, a Russian guy in the 1900s went into to steal stuff in the church, and he got in there and was taking stuff out, and all of a sudden he looked up and looked at the icon of Christ, I guess, looked at the icon, and those eyes, holy crapola, the guy dropped everything and ran out of the church. Now, are you going to call it, I mean, that's apparently a historical thing. Are you going to call that a miracle? Are you going to call that the Lord working through a picture? The result, however, was that a man was convicted, was convinced, was turned, was repentant. I like that. And I'm sure there are other examples of such events. Before I go and Oh yeah, everybody, they're all over the place. I even heard one time some priest said that this is an icon was doubly miraculous. Doubly miraculous? What is that? How can it? What is doubly? It means happened twice, or it's super, or more powerful than the others. I mean, it's like in the Latin Middle Ages. There, we know all when you have a relic and people start to come.
Well, let me pose you this question: what synod are you part of, Father Stephen?
I'm in a retired priest in the Carpatho-Russian Diocese of Constantinople.
And
our bishop is in Johnstown.
And so liturgically, you commemorate certain icons in Ukraine, because I know the Russian calendar does. I presume their calendar is the same.
I'm basically out. My formation tradition is in the Russian tradition, not very much in the Greek or the Arabic tradition.
And so, there in the hagiographic tradition, there's particular icons that even have days on the calendar, which are reputed to be miraculous, that God has used them for specific miracles. And so the church has in the Sixnaria certain icons which we do identify as serving that function for certain periods of time. But that doesn't mean every time we hear of an icon allegedly doing something that it's one of those.
No.
And so we have to be critical as well.
The ones we celebrate have been at least vetted, vetted through church history, through something other than, somebody on a mountain says something, and so we all take that as true.
Well, as long as it's Moses or Christ on that mountain.
It's like, say that again?
I said, as long as it's Moses or Christ on the mount.
Well, that's different. That's different.
We have, this is an interesting question. Father, have you read anything by Catherine, I can't pronounce the name, Arsenigel, tracing the earliest Christian images to Roman panel portraits?
Well, we know what was one of the significant cultural items among the Romans. They were great on portraits. They painted portraits and made statues. I mean, that was their thing. They really liked that. And so, again, why, or even the Fayum sarcophagi and the mummies. There's nothing wrong, and in our point of view, my point of view, there's nothing wrong with seeing some cultural thing in the Roman world. After all, they lived in the Roman world, Greco-Roman world. They see that portraits, they know that portraits are not necessarily gods. And so what would be wrong with saying that the early Christians, seeing portraits of all kinds of people all over the place, not gods, but portraits of this person, that Cato, or whoever, and saying, well, let's make a portrait of Jesus, of John, of Paul, of Peter, the Virgin Mary. Let's make portraits of them. That's the whole principle of adopting and adapting, which is a principle that, as I've said before, is one of the, that's the foundational principle of the whole cultural adoption and adaptation into the Roman world, which is not a bad thing, but it's selective. You can't take everything, and they knew that. They can't take everything. So now, I don't see that would be a bad thing. I don't know if this lady is saying, oh, well, look, the Christian tradition goes back to the Roman portraiture, and therefore it's no good. I don't know if she's saying that. Maybe she's saying something else. But I would say if that's true, bravo, great.
Now we have. I'll have this as the last question. Father John Whiteford asked.
Really? Oh, I like this.
Well, we got to go easy on ourselves.
Why?
Why? Because last night in the middle of the night, 1-something a.m., I have an intruder unannounced in my house.
Really?
It was my mother-in-law.
Uh-oh.
And, and we didn't know she was even coming, so I'm operating in very little sleep.
Okay, all right.
So that being said,
I mean, here the old guy is ready to go, keep on going, and the young guy, well,
no,
wait a minute,
I'm the oldest 37-year-old dude that you'll ever run into.
How old do you give me for?
Are you 74?
No,
I'm
78.
So there you go. Well, you don't look a day over 74.
Oh, thanks a lot. I like that. You're a good guy.
So anyway, Father John Whiteford says, looks like the book on early church and icons is out of print. Are there any plans to get it reprinted?
You can get the book. You can get my book, The Early Attitudes of Early on a platform called Smash Words, SMASH Words, WORDS. That's an ebook platform. I've put all of my stuff on that ebook platform, and all you have to do is type in Smash Words, one word, and then when it opens up, you put in my name, S. Bigham, like Big Ham, S. Bigham, and boing, they're all there, and they're all free, unless of course,
look at that,
and unless of course someone's conscience bothers them sufficiently to leave a tip.
There you go.
And they're all there, so take them all and do what you want with them.
And if your conscience bothers you that you're not doing enough to support the churches in Cambodia, you guys in the audience go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, and the link is below.
This is a commercial.
That's right. And support the parishes of Cambodia. So you can go to smashwords.com and steal Father Stephen's books and give him a few bucks. And you can also give a few bucks to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate to support evangelism in Cambodia. We need consistent donors. Well, Father, let me give you an opportunity to give any last thoughts. It's been a real pleasure having you on, giving perspective. I think, honestly, a very moderate perspective on and impartial on ante-Nicene art in the Christian world. So, any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Father?
Well, I would say it's a very dangerous thing for people to study this question of Christian art, icons, theology of icons. That's basically what we're talking about, Nicaea and everything. Because in our time, icons, you see icons everywhere in the weirdest places, and people seem to be attracted or fascinated by them, and they either are scared to death that they feel someplace in their being an attraction to this kind of eschatological art, and so they run away and reject it, or they feel themselves being drawn to it, and they go deeper and go deeper and go deeper until they have been seduced and are so in love with the theological vision that is promoted through Christian art, icons, that they say, I just have to go where these things are. And they end up becoming Orthodox. Be careful, folks. It's a dangerous subject. That's
Yeah,
it.
we'll end up like you, right?
Oh
We'll
Lord,
become one
have
of us,
mercy. Oh, you'll be bald. Oh Lord, no, no, no.
and we'll learn French.
Oh yeah, mais bien sûr.
Well, Father Stephen, it's been great. Hopefully, we could keep this conversation going. I know you've done much other work, and just so people know, that you go to Smashwords, and Father Stephen's done great work. Also, you could read this on academia.edu on icons of the Father. That's things people talk about. The blessing of icons.
Oh la 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 la.
Saint Epiphanius. He gets a lot of critical stuff about Saint Epiphanius. We have barely scratched the surface. We just stuck with Ante-Nicene art today, and so it's been a real pleasure to be able to speak with this with you because you've done so much work on this topic.
It's my fun too. I love it.
Well, Father Stephen, I'm going to sign out. Please stay on. A little bit after I close out, but I will tell the audience: fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.
Bye bye.